O billionario eneokas dankar com non-gem, 8k a faxinera entrucom sua, feelha the entire ballroom froze as though time itself had been caught in a sudden pause. The music played on, violins trembling in the air, but every pair of eyes turned toward the door. The billionaire, Alessandro Cortez, a man whose wealth and power often made others tremble before his presence, stood still at the center of the marble floor. All night, countless women in jeweled gowns had approached him, each hoping for the privilege of sharing a single dance. Yet he had declined them all, his cold refusal delivered with a polite smile that left no room for insistence. And then she walked in. Luciana, the cleaning lady who worked in the great mansion, entered the ballroom timidly, her simple uniform a stark contrast to the shimmering gowns and tailored suits that filled the room. At her side, holding her hand, was a little girl no older than 8, her daughter, wearing a modest white dress that swayed with every small step. The child's eyes sparkled, not with diamonds, but with the innocence of wonder as she gazed at the chandeliers and the gilded walls. For the first time that evening, Alessandro's hardened face shifted. His lips parted slightly, his gaze softened, and something long buried stirred within him. Memories. Painful, vivid memories of a daughter he had once lost. A child with the same kind of brightness in her eyes, the same way of clutching tightly at her mother's hand as though it were the anchor to her whole world. The guests whispered, scandalized by the audacity. A cleaning lady? Here, at a gala of such grandeur? Who allowed her entry? Yet, strangely, Alessandro did not seem angered. Instead, he stepped forward, his black shoes echoing against the polished floor, each step deliberate and firm. He approached Luciana and her daughter, and silence fell so deep that even the violins seemed to quiet themselves in anticipation. Luciana's face flushed with embarrassment. She bent her head and stammered, "Forgive us, Signor, my daughter only wanted to see the lights, and I tried to stop her, but—" Alessandro raised a hand, silencing her without a word. He knelt down, his tailored suit creasing, and looked directly into the child's eyes. "What is your name, Pequeña?" he asked gently, his voice stripped of the arrogance the guests were accustomed to hearing. The little girl tilted her head shyly and whispered, "Isabella." Alessandro smiled faintly. That name. It felt like fate itself had chosen to pierce through his armor. His heart trembled. Rising slowly, he turned not to the crowd, but to the musicians. "Play something soft," he commanded. His voice, though calm, carried authority that no one dared to question. The violins obeyed, shifting into a melody so tender it seemed woven from threads of longing and hope. Then, to the astonishment of every soul in the room, Alessandro extended his hand toward Luciana. "Dance with me," he said. Her eyes widened, disbelief flashing across her face. "Signor, I cannot. I don't belong here." But he did not lower his hand. His eyes, dark and unyielding, locked with hers. "Belonging," he murmured, "is not defined by the gown you wear, but by the courage you carry." The guests gasped, their whispers turning into ripples of outrage and fascination. Some laughed nervously, others clenched their jaws in silent disapproval. Yet Alessandro did not waver. Luciana hesitated only a moment longer before placing her trembling hand into his. The room seemed to sigh as he led her to the center of the floor, his grip steady, his presence protective. As they began to move, the transformation was undeniable. Though she was no trained dancer, her steps uncertain at first, Alessandro guided her with such patience and grace that soon she floated with him, her fear melting into the rhythm of the music. The little girl watched with wide eyes, her small hands clasped over her chest, as though she were witnessing a fairy tale come alive. In that dance, Alessandro's cold facade cracked open, revealing a man capable of tenderness, of remembrance, of longing for what he had lost. The crowd, no matter how much they disapproved, could not deny the beauty unfolding before them. It was as though two worlds, one of unimaginable wealth and another of humble survival, had collided, not in chaos but in harmony. And in that moment, as Alessandro twirled Luciana gently beneath the golden light, the whispers around them no longer mattered. The only sound that truly existed was the quiet beating of hearts daring to feel something unexpected. The music carried them deeper into a space that felt timeless, and though neither of them spoke, their silence was a conversation far louder than words could ever reach. The air was heavy with curiosity, wonder, and a secret sense that the night was only beginning to unravel into something none of them could have ever predicted. The music swirled around them like an invisible tide, carrying their steps across the polished marble floor, each movement more intimate than the last. Luciana's cheeks flushed with heat as her heart thundered in her chest. She had never imagined herself in such a place. Never mind in the arms of the man everyone in the city whispered about. His presence was overwhelming, yet strangely comforting. For all the stories she had heard of his coldness, his arrogance, and his unshakable pride, he held her as though she were fragile glass, careful not to let her stumble, guiding her with a gentleness that disarmed her completely. The crowd, however, could not remain silent. Murmurs spread like wildfire, hissing discontent through jeweled lips and narrowed eyes. Some of the women whispered spitefully, their envy as sharp as daggers. "A cleaning woman," one hissed. "Does he mock us?" another asked, clutching her pearls. Men exchanged knowing glances, some sneering at the scandal unraveling before them, others masking intrigue behind stoic faces. But Alessandro heard none of it. His world, for the first time in years, narrowed down to the woman in his arms and the child who watched them with such innocent awe. Luciana's steps became steadier as she began to surrender to the music. The room blurred, the guests melted into shadows, and all she felt was the strength of his hand guiding hers, the rhythm carrying her across the floor. It was a moment stolen from another life, one she had never dreamed belonged to her. She dared not look him in the eyes for too long, for when she did, she saw a depth of sorrow mingled with tenderness, a man haunted by ghosts she could not name. Alessandro, on the other hand, found himself studying her face as though trying to memorize it. The simplicity of her beauty was unlike the polished glamour of the women who often sought him. There was no artifice, no hunger for power in her gaze. She moved not to impress, but because she had been asked, reluctantly, humbly, almost as if she were afraid of insulting the very air she breathed in that hall. And it was that humility, that quiet strength beneath her shyness, that pulled him toward her like a current he could not resist. The music shifted, rising softly, and Alessandro twirled her beneath the chandeliers. Gasps rippled across the room as her skirt flared gently, catching the golden light. In that instant, Luciana was transformed, not into a queen or a lady of society, but into something purer. Untouched by wealth, uncorrupted by ambition, she was radiant in her authenticity. And when Alessandro caught her once more, steadying her with his hand at her waist, a hush fell that no disapproving glance could break. From the edge of the room, Isabella clapped her hands softly, her little face glowing with pride. She had never seen her mother look so alive, so full of light. To her, it was not scandalous nor strange. It was magic, the kind of moment only a child's heart could recognize without the weight of judgment. Alessandro noticed the girl's joy, and a pang cut through him so sharp it nearly stole his breath. He had known this before. He had seen small hands clapping for him, heard a little voice cheering his name, only for it all to be torn away by fate's cruel hand. And though Luciana could not know the storm brewing inside him, she felt it in the way his grip tightened just slightly, as though holding her was the only thing tethering him to the present moment. The song neared its end, the violins lingering in the air like the last rays of twilight. Slowly, reluctantly, he guided her to a stop. The final note faded, and silence rushed in once more. For a heartbeat, the room dared not breathe. All eyes were fixed on them, waiting for Alessandro's next move, for the verdict that would decide whether this dance was to be remembered as scandal or legend. He released her hand, but did not step back. Instead, he turned to the musicians and said, again. His voice was quiet but firm, leaving no space for protest. The maestro lifted his bow once more, and the melody began anew. This time, Alessandro did not only take Luciana's hand. He extended his other hand toward Isabella. The little girl's eyes widened, and she looked to her mother, uncertain. But Alessandro knelt once more, his hand steady and patient. "A princess should know how to dance," he said softly. Luciana's heart twisted, tears threatening to break free. She nodded gently, encouraging her daughter forward. Isabella slipped her tiny hand into Alessandro's, and with careful grace, he lifted her onto his arm. With Luciana by his side and the child in his embrace, he began to move again, slower now, more tender. The sight was unlike anything the guests had ever witnessed. A billionaire, untouchable and feared, who had rejected the advances of the finest women in society, now swayed across the floor with a cleaning woman and her little girl. The scandal burned hotter, yet so did the fascination. For some, it was an outrage. For others, it was a revelation that perhaps power did not always find its match in wealth, but in the purity of an untainted soul. Luciana's steps faltered, Not from clumsiness, but from the weight of the moment pressing into her chest. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the whole world had been cracked open to see her deepest secret. The longing for a life beyond survival, for a moment where she could simply exist as more than her uniform, more than her struggles. And yet, in Alessandro's eyes, there was no judgment. Only recognition, as though he saw not the woman society dismissed, but the strength she carried silently every day. As the second dance unfolded, something began to change in the air. The whispers grew quieter, the disapproval dulled, replaced by something else, an undeniable pull, an acknowledgement of beauty too raw to be denied. Even those who despised her could not look away. For the ballroom was no longer just a stage of opulence. It had become a place where vulnerability danced hand in hand with power, where sorrow and hope collided beneath crystal lights. The music slowed once more, the final notes trembling like fragile wings in the air. Alessandro stopped, lowering Isabella gently to the floor. She giggled, clapping again, oblivious to the sea of eyes fixed upon them. Luciana, breathless, struggled to meet his gaze, terrified of what came next, terrified of waking from a dream she had never dared to dream. But Alessandro did not speak. Not yet. He stood tall, his hand lingering at her back, his eyes scanning the room with the quiet authority of a man who had made his choice, and who would not allow the world to undo it. And though no words passed between them, the silence spoke louder than any declaration. It promised that what had begun tonight was not to be easily forgotten. Not by him, not by her, and certainly not by anyone who had witnessed the impossible unfold before their very eyes. The chandeliers glittered above them, but even their brilliance paled against the strange, fragile glow that lingered in the space between Luciana, her daughter, and the man who, for the first time in years, had chosen to dance. The night stretched into something unforgettable, a memory carved deep into the marble of that grand hall and the hearts of those who had witnessed it. When the music finally faded for the last time, Alessandro Cortez did not release Luciana immediately. He lingered for a moment, his hand resting gently at the curve of her back, his gaze locked with hers as though he were searching for something. An answer, a truth, or perhaps forgiveness for the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. Luciana's breath caught, her pulse racing, but she did not pull away. There was something in his eyes, a tenderness wrapped in grief, that told her this was more than a dance. It was a breaking, a mending, a rebirth of a man who had hidden behind wealth and walls for too many years. Around them, the crowd struggled to compose themselves. Many still bristled with disdain, their envy sharpened by disbelief, but others felt something stir within them that they could not quite name. For they had not only seen a billionaire dance with a cleaning woman, they had seen pride crumble before humility, sorrow turn toward hope, and a man known for rejecting the world embrace what was most ordinary, most real, and most divine. It was a story that would be whispered long after the chandeliers were dimmed, each retelling bending between scandal and awe. Alessandro finally let his hand fall away, though his eyes did not leave hers. He turned to Isabella, bending slightly, his voice softer than the silks brushing against the floor. "Thank you, Princessa," he whispered. "You reminded me tonight what joy feels like." The little girl beamed, clutching her mother's hand proudly, unaware of the weight her innocence had lifted from a man burdened by grief. Luciana, still uncertain, dipped her head respectfully. "We didn't mean to interrupt, Signor. Please forgive us." But Alessandro shook his head, his voice calm yet unshakable. "No interruption, Luciana. You gave this night its only meaning." The words struck like lightning through the hall. Gasps erupted once more, louder this time, for the statement was not a passing kindness. It was an acknowledgement, public and undeniable. A billionaire, who could have had the world at his feet, had declared that meaning came not from diamonds or titles, but from a woman whom society overlooked and her child who dared to smile in a room filled with masks. He straightened, his jaw tightening as he turned to face the guests. His voice rose, resonant and commanding, echoing across the marble. "For years, I have danced with no one. Not because I thought none were worthy, but because I could not bring myself to feel. Tonight, I danced because I was reminded of something I lost, and of something I might find again, not in power or wealth, but in humanity." The silence that followed was immense, like the stillness after a storm. No one dared to laugh, though some sneered, their pride wounded. Yet even those who despised the sight could not erase the truth of what they had seen. Alessandro offered his arm once more to Luciana, and though every instinct in her told her to refuse, to retreat into the shadows where she belonged, her daughter's hand pressed into hers, urging her forward. She placed her hand on his arm, trembling, and he led her and Isabella through the center of the hall. The crowd parted reluctantly, the murmurs rising behind them like waves crashing against a shore. But Alessandro did not falter. His steps were deliberate, his posture regal, and his silence thunderous. By the time the great doors closed behind them, the air inside the ballroom was thick with the weight of a legend in the making. Outside, the night air was cool, filled with the scent of roses from the gardens. The stars stretched endlessly above them, indifferent to wealth or poverty, twinkling the same for kings and beggars alike. Luciana drew in a shaky breath, the enormity of what had happened pressing down on her chest. She could not understand why a man like him had chosen her, even for a single dance, nor what it meant for the life she had carefully kept hidden from the eyes of judgment. Alessandro studied her quietly, his expression unreadable at first, until at last he spoke. "I know what they will say of tonight. They will mock, they will sneer, they will invent stories. But none of that matters, not to me." His eyes softened as they fell upon Isabella, who clutched her mother's skirt, blinking sleepily. "What matters is that for the first time in years, I felt alive." Luciana swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Why me?" The corner of his mouth lifted faintly, not quite a smile, but something gentler. "Because you are real. Because you do not hide behind masks, even when the world tries to push you into the shadows. Because your daughter looked at this hall as if it were a palace of dreams, not a cage of pride. And because when I held your hand, I remembered that I still have a heart." Her eyes filled, but she quickly blinked away the tears, unwilling to let them fall. She had survived too much, endured too many struggles, to allow herself the luxury of breaking down now. Yet something inside her shifted, a spark ignited not by promises of riches or power, but by the possibility that even the most broken hearts could find rhythm again. Isabella tugged at Alessandro's hand. "Will you dance with us again, Signor?" she asked, her voice innocent and pure. He crouched down to meet her gaze, his eyes misting with a tenderness he had long buried. "Yes, Pequeña," he said softly. "As many times as you wish." And in that vow, spoken not to society, not to shareholders or politicians, but to a child whose only treasure was her mother's hand, Alessandro revealed the truth of who he had become. He was no longer simply the billionaire untouchable, feared and admired in equal measure. He was a man who had chosen, finally, to live again, not in the cold marble halls of power, but in the fragile, priceless warmth of connection. The carriage lights flickered in the distance, waiting to carry him back to his world of gilded walls and endless expectations. But Alessandro did not move. For the first time in years, he did not feel the urgency of time, the weight of deals, or the pull of reputation. He stood beside Luciana and her daughter, as though he belonged nowhere else. The night carried them forward into silence, but it was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a story not yet finished, a silence brimming with promise. And though the world would remember the scandal, though tongues would wag and newspapers would twist the truth into ink and ink into spectacle, those who had seen it with their own eyes would never forget the sight. A billionaire who would not dance with anyone until a cleaning woman walked in with her child. And in that dance, he found not disgrace, but redemption. And so the tale was sealed, not with jewels or crowns, but with the simple, eternal truth that sometimes the richest man in the room is the one who dares to give his heart to the humblest soul.